It is now the top of the hour, and I would like to welcome everyone to the second of a four-part series of presentations that Reg and I are doing this week. This presentation follows yesterday's, where Reg laid out a little bit of history of organizations over the last 2,200 years, and I focused on some of the challenges or the assumptions that we make about organizations and change of those organizations, the assumptions that we often fail to consciously recognize, but actually impact the way we practice, the changes and how to influence organizations. In this particular session, we're going to go a little bit deeper, and we're going to pick up where we left off yesterday, and we're going to explore some of the challenges that are before us by looking at examples of other companies. The companies we're going to be looking at are a selection of some that Reg and I have studied. They are what might be called non-traditional organizations, in that they don't have just a traditional hierarchy. They may be a network structure, or it may be a traditional hierarchy with a network attached to it. So what we're going to focus on is what can we learn from these organizations that we might be able to then generalize, because what you will find is that none of the organizations really do everything exactly the same and all have some limitations. In this particular presentations, we're going to see what we can learn and how we can actually apply that going forward in our thinking about organizational change and organizations themselves. So what we're going to be doing then is looking at the design of an organization that is capable of routine, proactive change, thereby minimizing the traditional reliance on episodic disruptive change, which most of our change models are built around. We're going to be looking at control to a large extent, because as we mentioned yesterday, when you look at organizations, the traditional hierarchy is really built more for control than it is built for getting work done. And the control is necessary, but there's alternate ways to think about how you can control an organization. We're also going to be looking at empowerment to some extent, which is within the control element. And that oftentimes we think about empowerment as something that is granted to you by someone in authority. Rarely do we look at it as boundary testing. In this case, explicit granting of empowerment versus the implicit that it's there for your taking, and you're going to see that a lot in these organizational structures. Yesterday, we left off with the core requirements for the organizations of the future as we see them. First off was the autonomy and an action orientation. This is an independence of leadership across the organization, but also a tendency toward action versus a tendency toward getting approval from someone else. We're talking about responsiveness. This is a customer-facing responsiveness that is not only to external customers, but internal customers, that has some tension built into it with purpose. One of the areas of control is to basically keep the organization from flying apart if you make individual parts responsive for taking their own action. So if you release the passions of some people throughout the organization, then you also have to find a way to bring them back to a purpose to keep them cohesive. This also then requires some alignment through the cross-organizational linkages and how that can be accomplished outside of the traditional communication up, across, and then down between silos. We're also now going to be jumping into what are some of the alternate pathways for how to design organizations and how they structure. The requirements for the organization then. Drilling down into more detail, let's look at responsiveness. In this case, I'm using the cat video. I figure all presentations at some point need some cat, but this really fits pretty well. I'm talking about responsiveness from an agility, but I'm hesitant to use agility because it means so much in so many different ways in different contexts today. What we're really talking about is the focus and the responsiveness to a purpose and how that is accomplished in an organization. This then requires an obvious customer-facing responsiveness, and again, not only to the external customer, but to the internal customers. To accomplish this, there is a need for line of sight for individual jobs to the organizational outcome. This is one of the key things that comes up repeatedly in HR activities, is how to connect people to the work and the purpose of that work. This often is difficult, but we're going to see in some of the examples this morning that there are easy ways of doing it that companies are doing on a regular basis. We're also talking about the direct lines of communication, having organizational transparency and eliminate a lot of the filtering and handoffs that happen throughout the organization. Too often, what happens in organizations that is information is really situational at that particular place of work, and it gets pushed up into the organization for a response.
Okay. Ross, has the slide frozen again?
Don't know. You should be seeing the bottom of avoid filtering.
No, we're still on alternative pathways.
Oh, let's see. It's frozen. Okay. Share. I think there's too many people homeschooling in the neighborhood. Reg, are we back to slide one?
No, there's nothing yet. It just says it started screen sharing, but it hasn't said what. You haven't got anything on there.
Oh boy. It says starting screen share.
I just love technology when it works.
I know. Let me go ahead and start walking through it. And I'll try to pull up the bullet points a little sooner and see if the screen will catch up to my voiceover.
Yep.
And let me jump to slide 4.
Yep, that's coming up.
Okay. Slide 4 then is looking at the requirements that we need. First off was the autonomy we talked about. This gets into the timely decision-making in the organization that oftentimes is slowed down through the traditional hierarchy, the control, the filtering of information, the lack of connections between parts of the organization, and the dependence upon using the hierarchy for decision-making as well as communication. We're also talking about now principle-based decision-making. We focus on this because when you try to release people to be independent, they need some guidance of how to make the decisions because they're no longer under the control of their management structure. So the key then is how to make decisions within some principle structure so that they have got that necessary guidance. For autonomy also, people have to act in consultation with others, and if the risk is affordable. Risk is affordable comes from effectuation that we talked about yesterday, and you're going to see it in a couple of the examples today. We're also talking then about organizational sense making, how that sense making can be distributed across the organization and not just in key parts of the organization, such as a planning department or the executives themselves. This then also gets into effectuation thinking about the entrepreneurship spirit and how to keep that type of spirit alive after the organization starts getting big beyond the ability of a single person to really control it. Shifting to slide 5 then, we're now looking at the cross linkages necessary in an organization for an alignment. part of this addresses the boundary decisions and the clarity of the decision rights across those boundaries. Traditional hierarchies manages that for people, but once you go to a distributed structure, then there needs to be some type of clarification for that. This requires some minimal structure for direct communication, such that people are communicating without necessarily getting too bogged down with having to communicate with people that aren't necessary. This also further requires some integration for purpose alignment. Purpose alignment traditionally is within the control of the hierarchy, but once you get out of a hierarchical structure, then alternate ways need to be brought into place. And some persistence of what is often avoided. Too often organizations spend majority of their time firefighting, and they run into problems, both strategic and operational problems, because they're not focused on where the organization needs to go. This is what you might say, the 20% that adds the 80% of the value, but it's the firefighting that pushes out the ability. So we need some persistence of how to keep focused on what needs to be focused with some clarity, but not let it interfere with the people that are doing the work. This requires then some focus on functions of the organization and how those functions are carried out. 6 for slide. The question then comes is, how do we attain such an organization? And more importantly, what can we learn from some of the non-traditional organizations that are successfully using either a network structure or a hierarchy with it, maybe a network attached to it? And then what are the design elements that are associated with that, so that we can generalize and figure out how can we then organize for work and not for control. This requires then an examination of structure, the relationships among the people in the organization and the processes, as well as organizational behavior, which may be called culture, but culture, again, is often used in multiple ways. So we want to just simplify it as the behavior of people within the organization. We're now going to turn to a series of examples of non-traditional organizations. These are not all of them, and I'm a little hesitant because it's almost a data dump. There's so much information here, but a lot of the details already been published on the Change Management Network as articles, and a few others are in pre-publication now and will be forthcoming in the next few weeks. What I want to focus on, though, is what is done differently in some of these organizations, and what might we learn from them, both in what is done well as what are some of the challenges that they face. Turning to Sociocracy and Holacracy. Holacracy would be a subset, a proprietary subset of Sociocracy, which is open source. This has a design that's built around teams. Okay. While it's a team structure, though, it is also viewable as a hierarchy. If you think about grouping people on a traditional hierarchy into teams or groups, and then look at the hierarchy from the top down, you could actually see the structure here in the upper right-hand corner of linked teams themselves. In so doing, there is a retention of positional power within a hierarchy, but it's not a hierarchy of people. It's really a hierarchy of circles with people embedded in those circles. This gives really maximum autonomy with clear decision rights within each circle. And that's one of the real benefits here of sociocracy, is the clear decision rights to make any decision, but then also linkages as is needed. But you'll notice that the linkages don't go across the organization. They go up, across, and then down, similar to a traditional hierarchy. A key component is also decision by consent. which is gained through discussion. This is not necessarily a veto power, but anybody who has a concern about any decision has the rights to hold up that decision until they discuss it and address those concerns. So this adds then to what might be called some of the limitations, in that while you've eliminated some of the bureaucracy of a traditional hierarchy, you've replaced it with another bureaucracy, in this case, formal processes for the documentation and the meeting facilitation. This takes a great deal of learning, and when Zappos shifted over to Holacracy, there was a significant turnover because of the operating style, that while it freed you to make decisions, it also became very heavy loaded with the bureaucracy of the meetings, but also the documentation of those meetings for sharing across the organization. Change also led to what they called role proliferation. While change was easily initiated, it did not easily kill other things, so that when new changes were put in place, people picked up new roles in addition to their old roles, and you ended up having some personal conflicts in as to how to prioritize time among the different roles that people are taking on as the organization changes themselves. There's also some dual linkages, which is an interesting concept in a way, in that instead of just having a top-down type of linkage, in addition to the top-down linkage, there's a second person in each circle that is responsible for linking upward. So there's actually a two-way communication between circles here. One pushes information down, another person actually pushes information up. But again, while this adds to the benefit of increased communication, it also comes with some overload of the burden associated with that. Meeting time to reach a consent often is a key issue. And I find a very steep learning curve. When I look through the information that Sociocracy has, and there's really multiple bodies that have Sociocracy because it is open source. So you're going to see different variations between the different governing bodies for Sociocracy. But even within Holacracy, there is a significant amount of documentation and training materials and how to train people in the meeting process and the decision-making process itself, such that it is not an easy way to bring someone on board without bringing them not only into that version of Sociocracy, but then how to make it operational. I'd like to now turn to Kotter's dual operating system. This comes from Kotter's book, Accelerate, which builds upon what he did earlier in Leading Change. Leading Change, as most people will know, focused on the 8 key problems that organizational change managers face and how to overcome those. It's not a methodology as much as it is a framework. When Kotter shifted into Accelerate, he brought out the dual operating system because he was then focusing not on episodic change, but in Accelerate, he was trying to focus on continuous change. And he saw problems with the traditional operating system and added a dual system. What he actually did was create a shadow system behind the traditional hierarchy. The shadow system is really a network that shortens the lines of communication, but he did retain the traditional hierarchy. So what you then have is a traditional decision-making authority and control structure in place, and connected to that is a secondary network that makes the connections that the traditional hierarchy often fails to make. So it's really kind of a Band-Aid workaround, but to many extents it's also what might be called half-baked compared to some of the other organizations we're about to talk about. One of the advantages is that ad hoc teams can easily come into being to investigate problems and opportunities. This is easily accomplished with a mechanism to initiate and coordinate the changes. So there is some real benefit, and there are a few organizations in the world, but mostly smaller organizations that are using the dual operating system. But it also comes with some limitations. And the limitations emerge with really little guidance about how to accomplish or repair the problems associated with the limitations. For example, the traditional hierarchy remains in place. So while you've got a dual operating system that helps with communication, helps with carrying out change, it still is being done within the traditional hierarchy. It also has a formal charter of volunteers, which I find rather interesting in that you can volunteer and you can initiate the formation of new network structures in the dual system, but it needs some formalization from the hierarchy to really get it chartered for having any authority. It also comes with no cross-organizational alignment, in that these can pop up, and the only alignment would then come from the traditional hierarchy and the control from that hierarchy and how they formalize these new teams that are developing within the dual system. But again, it's an interesting structure because it is attempting to address some of the problems that a hierarchy has, and doing so with a network structure. Shifting over to Nucor Steel, this is a very interesting organization in that it is super, super flat and decentralized. The flat hierarchy really makes it necessary that it has to structure with the network support itself, okay, in that there is so little levels of management that individuals at one level are pretty much having to focus on their peers in other parts of the organization. So while the hierarchy still exists, they've gone to the extreme of cutting out as many intermediate levels as possible from top to bottom. This has the real benefit of distributed decision-making across the organization. It also has an autonomy with a cultural emphasis on experimentation. And this is really from the very beginning of when they disrupted the steel industry with their business model of the mini mills, but then to some extent also continued that disruption with their style of operation. In that throughout the organization, there is a constant desire to learn and experiment with new ways of doing things and new ways of thinking about the business itself. What's interesting is that while the experimentation takes place and great learning takes place, there is no standardization of that new learning. But there is wide sharing across the organization of what is learned. So it's like everybody is designed their experiments within their local area. They are learning, and then similar to this type of sharing, there are numerous conferences, not only online, but visitations of other places or global conferences within Nucor personnel where they share their practices. And they basically tell what they did, what they learned, and in the process, the different parts of their organization that might be their peer, they don't necessarily have to adopt it at all, but they can learn from it and see how they can adapt it to their particular situation. So there's great opportunity there for change across the organization, but very informally done. It does come, though, with some limitations in that it's got a good end state, but Nucor really developed this structure over the life of the organization. And when you take a look at their current state, and we're trying to compare it to a traditional hierarchy, it is very difficult to figure out how to do a transition pathway because it is such a dramatic change and there's no parts that can be pulled out and used separately. It's also built on trust. I'm not sure if that's a problem, but a lot of organizations, again, if you were to transition to this structure, it would be very difficult because trust would have to be established first. So one of the limitations then is which comes first, the trust or the flat decentralized structure, vice versa. It also comes with some employee development of really the culture and how they do the operations themselves. Another organization that really developed their principles from the beginning of the organization is Gore. Okay. Gore and his wife, when they formed the organization around the Gore-Tex fabric, they really built a strong culture of individuals working together. They use a traditional hierarchy, but they offset the control and the rigidness of that through the culture itself and how people were to work. And they did that through a series of principles. And this is a good learning point in that principles can drive the behavior of the organization, even if the hierarchy might otherwise fight that through control. One of the principles that Gore uses is freedom. And that's actually the word that they use. It's the trust between people and the ability to freely network with others. In this case, it's almost like the Kotter dual system in that you have a traditional hierarchy, but there is freedom to network with anyone across the organization that you feel would be beneficial to you and your part of the organization. They've basically taken that part of the Kotter's dual system and they have operationalized it without the formalization of charters. They just let people do it. This is also built on a principle of fairness and the attitude toward others, which gets to the people point of view that Gore's brought to the organization. A third principle is commitment. Do what you promise. And again, to an extent that when you go to decentralization and you start to take away control, personal accountability starts to play more of a role. And that if you don't do what you promise, that starts to break down the relationships that are essential for a network to operate. Gore also has a principle that they call the waterline, which is very interesting in that it comes right out of effectuation of taking risks that are affordable, in which case it's not a risk management, but it's a consultation with others, an estimate of the risk, and if the decision were wrong, can you afford the risk? And if you can afford the risk, then like an entrepreneurial operation, you move forward with that and basically keep growing and you grow fast. So again, it's a shift from a traditional way of thinking about risk management to an effectuation thinking about taking risks that are affordable. It does come with a few limitations, not many. One is that it's mainly focused on the operations side and is kind of generalized across the rest of the organization for the staff and the top governance. And it does have an informal approach to networking. In this way, again, it is a better improvement on Kotter's dual system, but at the same time, things could be overlooked because there's no network weaving. People are making up the network structure as it occurs to them. There's no purposeful thinking about what network connections are needed. And while it is a good operating system, it doesn't really give much guidance on accelerating change because, again, the Gores designed their principles not for accelerating change or change. They designed it around how to manage the company, and it does very well from that perspective. I'd like to turn over to Hire Group. This is getting a very interesting point in that Hire was almost out of business not that long ago, but one very strong, charismatic, visionary leader saw a way to change the whole company culture and approach. and that was building it around micro enterprises that were very entrepreneurial, in which case it is a true network. Even the staff functions are internal entrepreneurial networks. That takes to the extent that there's internal contracting between different parts of the organization, such that every micro enterprise is really customer facing, such that one manufacturing unit may then feed another manufacturing unit, which may then feed sales, which is outside external customer. But each of those manufacturing relationships, or the manufacturing to sales relationship, has a contract for delivery, same as if they were independent companies. Similarly, staff functions such as HR and IT are also structured as independent enterprises within the umbrella of the higher group. They also have service delivery contracts with other parts of the organization. What is very interesting here is that those contracts give a relationship, but individual customers within that don't necessarily have to buy internally, such that if a manufacturing microenterprise is facing dissatisfaction with an IT microenterprise and are not getting satisfactory response, they have an opportunity to actually go outside sourcing. And in some cases, internal microenterprises have gone out of business because they failed to satisfy their internal customers. Also, in some cases, a group that is dissatisfied with an internal microenterprise, they can actually charter a new microenterprise to start in competition with the first. So you've got a true, really competitive environment working within the groups, but at the same time, they have a beneficial relationship and a way of operating together. One of the ways that they operate together very well is that there's actually benefit sharing to the employees. The employees of a microenterprise are truly treated as owners of that microenterprise, and to the extent that there is superior results, not just average or target results, but superior results, some of that extra value is provided back to the employees. There's also very interesting, a desire that's very entrepreneurial also of open innovation. There is partnering to extend the capabilities within the organization, in which case each microenterprise, while it is working within the means available to it, it is encouraged to reach not only within the higher group for partners, but also outside. And much of the innovation comes with outside enterprises in a partnering with a contract that allows them to basically buy into the partner or buy into the partnership more if there were success. So it's an interesting way of doing away totally with not invented here thinking and looking for other opportunities and then bringing that in without really raising the risk because they're partnering and they're not taking the risks themselves. This is really an interesting structure, but it does still come with some limitations. The main limitation is the internal contract templates. It took them a while to develop a template for those microenterprise connections and how those contracts are actually written and implemented. I would like to see copies of that. Hire on their website is promoting their management structure, and they see it as a gift to the world of telling the world more about how they do things, but they have not yet revealed what those contracts actually look like. And again, that is a key part of the effectiveness of how those microenterprises are linked together. Similarly to those contracts is the transfer pricing itself that's tied to leading targets. And I've gotten some information on this, but it's not full. information. There's gaps in understanding how this actually operates, and that there is a multi-tier targeting system that is a mix of benchmarking to competition combined with goals and stretch targets. Based upon meeting those, the benefits that are generated within one particular microenterprise are actually shared with other microenterprises that are connected to it. This gets away from the infighting and the silo mentality of us versus them, and that if you were in one microenterprise and help another microenterprise, the benefits of the other enterprise would flow back to you. There's also an ability to renegotiate those contracts at will. So if the balance of value distribution between microenterprises changes, the contract can be redone. Now that's kind of innovative, but again, that takes a little bit more understanding of how that contracting process is done. There's also an ad hoc networking for the coordination. This is done through some purpose alignment, but around what they call platforms. Platforms would be industry oriented for the most part, in which case a number of microenterprises come together into a planning group that addresses common issues, common opportunities, and sorts through to some extent what might be called network weaving of how all the microenterprises are structured. So there is some purpose alignment in place, but it's through ad hoc networking or through the platforms themselves. Large network coordination across the organization really are strictly the ad hoc itself. Turning then to what have we learned? Let's look at this from a couple points of view, starting with the structural principles. We've seen that there's a number of companies now that are operating successfully as a network. They're operating with a customer facing, in the case of higher, even internal customer facing. With the small groups comes accountability, and it also eliminates handoffs that often are created as bottlenecks through a traditional hierarchy. We've also seen that it is possible to do some purpose alignment with autonomy. This is the tension between the two, such that there is some control between the decisions that are being made and the overall organization mission and purpose itself. This is done in a number of cases and is done with line of sight of why that particular individual or group's work impacts others in the organization. We've also seen how they're easily reconfigured for growth and change, in which case there is a change built in to the operating policy itself of how the structures within the network can change over time to not only be more efficient, but also to meet changing needs in the environment itself. Okay. Looking forward then for the operating principles. A key operating principles is distributed decision-making. And the decision-making is at the customer interface, which is often where the problems arise, such that there is a focus then continuously on customer needs and desires and how to bring that into the organization and take action on it. These companies also have great transparency in direct communication, oftentimes through the direct communication of the network itself, or possibly in the shadow network operating in conjunction with the hierarchy itself. Looking forward then, in another operating principles is to see elements of effectuation or the entrepreneurial spirit in many of these organizations, in which case they continue to operate with some entrepreneurial thinking, and they don't get bogged down in the thinking that often gets locked into the control of a traditional hierarchy. There's also a focus from effectuation to focus on what you can control and influence and not worry about what you can't control and influence. It's basically a action action orientation, but that action continues to focus on available resources or the means. This is a key difference between effectuation and causation. Causation looks at goals and figures out what resources are needed to meet those goals. Effectuation flips that around like entrepreneurs will do. They look at the resources they have available to them, which are the means, including the relationships they have with possible partner organizations, and then they take action toward goals that they can reach from those means. So it's really flipping around the resource goal direction. They also, as we've seen, do take risks if the loss is affordable. In some cases, explicit within their principles, they use that. But again, that gets back to effectuation. There's also a tendency to experiment and learn. But again, it's because there is focus at the individual work units themselves, even if they're a staff work unit, to continue to serve their customers, whether external or internal customers, better. So there is a consistent pressure to keep doing better. There's also forming of partnerships to extend the available resources such that they aren't limiting themselves just to what they have, nor are they limiting themselves to fighting for boundary conflicts. They're looking for those win-win situations, not only internally, but externally. So this then is a key alternative to causation thinking. The question then comes is, if an entrepreneurial company is built on effectuation, why, as it grows, do they shift over to a causation point of view? And when we talk later today, in the next presentation, we're going to get more into the reason behind that. And it really centers down that organizations are too often built for control, not for work. And that has a ripple effect on many, many other aspects of how they organize and operate. Summary then, what are the principles that have come out of from what we've seen from some of these other companies? In particular, what are the structural principles that we've seen as alternatives to a traditional hierarchy? We've seen that companies can operate, very large companies can operate as small networked operating units with a customer facing throughout the organization. We've seen organizations that are successfully doing that. We've seen them be able to purposely align across the organization, sometimes formally, sometimes informally. We've seen a number of operating principles, in particular, how to do distributed decision-making at the customer interfaces, both the internal and external customer interfaces. That is possible, in which case you're getting away from the control that's embedded in the traditional hierarchy. We've seen great transparency and open communication because you've eliminated much of the filtering and passing back and forth of information, not necessarily by the most direct route, but through the hierarchy itself. And to a large extent, when you look at these companies, there's great entrepreneurship spirit. The people have excitement for what they're doing because they are in control. We talked yesterday about resistance. Resistance often comes not from resistance against change, but resistance against being in control. To the extent that we put these operating principles and structure in place, you're actually releasing people and giving them control over what they do. You're giving them more control over the types of change and what changes than would be normally done in a traditional hierarchy, such that you're replacing resistance with giving them control itself. Moving forward then, okay, we're talking about principle-driven change. We're rethinking change itself within the context of organizations and how there is an interrelationship then between the structure of an organization and how it operates and how change has to be implemented within that structure itself. Yesterday, we talked about the foundation of why we need to rethink change. In this presentation, we focused more on the changes that we've seen that are possible in alternate structures. We've seen how some of these companies have closed that gap and have seen a new vision for the way they operate. Later today, we're going to be talking more about change as a business model. This is principle-driven action, in which case, as you decentralize your operations, you decentralize your control. Replacing that control would be principles of how to guide action. And then tomorrow, we're going to be talking more details about how this actually is implemented in an organization and making transitions to that type of organization. This brings me to the conclusion of exploring alternatives. Let me open the questions now. Reg, you've had an opportunity to look at the chat window, so you might be able to jump ahead of me and see what's there, and I'll catch up.
Yeah, there's a question here on the affordable calculation when we were talking about effectuation and looking at risk differently. And there are different levels of decision making and different levels involved for different reasons. And the example given here is medical care, so that you may have a physician assistant or a nurse can do something on their own, and others require consultation with the doctor. And these might extend beyond a strict financial calculation. So we're not looking at risk initially in terms of finance. How does that fit within this different view of taking risks?
Did you want to address that, Reg?
Yeah, okay. One of the things about risk is how we look at it. The nursing example, there is a financial indication there, particularly in some parts of the world where the liabilities of the people involved could be quite considerable, whereas in others it's not. And so you've got it at different levels. You've got the level of the financial risk if it goes wrong, and you've also got the decision whether it's the right one medically. And the idea of looking at risk within principles, as Ross said, the decision making isn't just about risk in isolation. It's within the framework of the principles. And so you design the appropriate principles for that type of decision making. And Ross will be explaining that much later today. For those of us in Europe, we'll probably be asleep. But in his part of the world, I think it's about 2 o'clock in the morning in our part of the world. And so it's not just looking at risk through one lens. It's looking at it through different lenses. What types of risks are there at that position? And then what are the principles that we need to have in order to guide that decision? Anything to add on that, Ross?
Yeah, it's really a different way of thinking. And what brought us to us was looking at different change models and seeing how they fit within continuous change. And many of them didn't fit. So we shifted over to looking at, do we need new change models? But then when we started to look further, we found out that much of the problems we have with change doesn't come up with the change models as much as it comes from the control that is built into the way we organize ourselves. And that control is a major limitation that not all companies have succumbed to. We've also looked then at entrepreneurship and effectuation theory in particular. And the question that came to mind is, why do companies move away from effectuation to causation? And that's one of the things we're talking about later today, because there is a way to see why that happens when you start to examine how an organization manages control as it grows from a single person hub and spoke operation into a traditional hierarchy. Certain things happen with control, and that if you go down one route, you end up with a very controlling structure itself, versus if you think about control from a different perspective, things are very different in how you organize yourself.
Yeah, can I just come back into this care one again with
Go ahead.
the nursing, because there's other questions here about the public sector. Ross has just given to us 3 or 4 simple examples of many, many that we've looked at. And I think in the care one, a good one to discuss here is the Buurtzorg organization in Holland, which does care in the community. From a very different point of view. It does it from a network point of view. It's got decentralized decision-making almost to the nth degree. It's based on principles. It is a very lean organization with hardly any management whatsoever. It's one level and so forth. And the outcome of that, which is to another question on here about how do you convince management about such approaches. Well, one of the problems you have with management is in many of these cases, there isn't any. And Buurtzorg is a very good example of this. They're very much self-managing teams in the community. They're very lean, very cost effective, and they are managing to achieve far more than the traditional approach to care, particularly for the customer. It's very customer focused, and it's now being copied throughout the world. So you can do it in the caring community, in hospitals and so forth. You've just got to start looking at it differently, we suggest.
A couple comments on some more detail on some of the examples. Gore does obviously have a financial focus and isn't really necessarily the best, but again, the key on the Gore is that it is a traditional model of business. They've been able to adapt an informal network too, along with management principles of how to really take care of some of the problems within the control itself. Similarly, one comment here on the dual operating system, which I find very true, in that because the traditional hierarchy remains in place, and there's some dependence in the dual system on the chartering, the key stakeholder is obviously the leadership of the traditional hierarchy. So the network that's operating in the shadows is operating under some control of the hierarchy itself. And that's where some of the problems exist, that when you get to Gore and you get into some of the Nucor and higher, you see a little bit more of the informal or the structuring of the network separate or eliminating with the traditional hierarchy. Different things start to happen. But again, I think Kotter at the time was groundbreaking with the dual operating system, but he got bogged down or maybe hindered with his thinking of keeping the traditional hierarchy and not figuring out how to better integrate or replace the traditional hierarchy itself. But again, it was groundbreaking at the time.
There's another one here about how are disputes among parties resolved. Tomorrow we'll go into some detail about how we suggest that can happen. The argument is, do we need managers to resolve disputes, and what causes the disputes? Are they a product of the way the organization's set up, or what is it? There are many, many reasons for disputes. And so, yes, you need some process of arbitration in such situations. And so we believe that that's a very important function, which we will cover in some detail tomorrow.
Yeah. Getting management buy-in is a key consideration too, and that several of the organizations we talked about today actually had top level buy-in right from the very beginning. So they basically championed it the entire time. In other cases, though, there is some power structures that will obviously be disrupted. But what Reg will be talking about tomorrow will address some of that. And to the extent that power structures are upset, they're actually replaced with something else that doesn't necessarily have positional power, but it's got power in a different way, in that it's able to impact the outcome much more than they may be able to do within just their current positional power itself. So the roles change, and with that role change opens up many more possibilities for what might be called personal achievement or accomplishment, and releasing individual passion. So it's a shift away from traditional power politics.
We're talking about power politics. Someone's mentioned governments here, and the Canadian model is an image of the British model. So I wish them well. And it's interesting. There is an organisation that is actually focused on the reformation of the traditional approach to government, such as Westminster and others. And their whole approach, they have designed 27 principles. And Ross and I have looked at them, and some of them are, I guess, really long-term wishes. But if you actually had that organization of government based on those 27 principles, it would be, my goodness, a very different world today. And so others are also looking at this principle thing for things like government organizations. But I think the dynamics of the holistic approach to governing, as we've seen with the current events in the US at the moment, is a bit more complicated than just the systems that are set up. But it is possible that many parts of government can be principle driven. And this is, again, what this organization is looking at. And we can put a link on our on the network to, if you're interested in looking at the work that they're doing.
Another question here talks about how to apply this to nonprofits or non-financial activity. I think it fits quite well in that it is no longer a strict, financial bottom line. It's purpose driven. What is the purpose? And a purpose of a government unit or a purpose of a nonprofit can very, very clearly be defined and evaluated. It's not necessarily have to be financial itself, because purpose has many components to it. So I think it fits very well in multiple arenas. Let's see here. I'm still trying to catch up.
Yeah.
Okay, recordings will be posted. I have the recordings from yesterday. I want to do a couple quick edits of that and hope to get that out there today or tomorrow. This one, I'll try to get out today, tomorrow also. And again, for anyone who's missing, obviously, for example, if you're in Europe, such as Reg, he will not be missing mine, because while I'll be presenting at 7 o'clock my time, Reg will be sleeping at 2 or 3 o'clock his time. So all those presentations will be posted in the video library at the top of the Change Management Network under topics. So given that we're running 72 hours straight in the conference with presenters and attendees around the world, obviously there's a need for the video library.
Yeah, I'd like to come into another question here. How can we address in a context of merger hierarchical alignment when companies are structured differently? And the answer to that is actually very well. And I use that example tomorrow to show how a hierarchical classic bureaucratic organization can be merged with this more open type organization that we're moving towards, and the process of doing that in outline. And then after the conference, we will be publishing and discussing on the forum much more detail of how that is achieved. But actually, by doing it through from a traditional to what we're proposing, it's a lot easier than you'll ever get with a traditional merger. And all of us who've been involved in such things know that they seldom are successful.
Right. Yeah. In the example that Reg will use tomorrow on the merger, it actually shows you how parts of this can be put in place without having to go to the total end state immediately. And that's a key thing we've always kept in mind, in that a desired end state is insufficient unless you're a startup moving toward that direction. All of the, hundreds of thousands, millions of companies around the world that have a traditional structure already, something needs to be done to help them make the transition without being replaced by a startup. There's going to be much more published on what we are doing. Some of the draft work has already been published out on the Change Management Network. Many of the articles that Reg and I have been publishing for the last year have been testing our ideas on others within the network. We will continue to do that as we put ideas together and continue to refine everything eventually into a book.
Yeah, there's one there about basically what I call the informal organization. And we've looked at the informal organization side in quite some detail, because this is what really runs organizations, not the formal structure and the rules and processes. And working to rule, as we know, will bring any company to its knees. And so by looking at the informal organization, it's actually based on the social network of the organization and the trust in each other, so that they can actually achieve what they're trying to achieve. Because people basically want to do and achieve what the organization wants of them. And very often they're prevented either because of one individual's different perspective in a senior position, or the processes themselves slow them down. And so it's bringing all of this together so that there will be less need. They'll always have an informal organization. That's natural behavior. But by bringing it into this sort of network approach with principle-based decision and distributed decision-making, we reduce the need for such an informal organization.
One comment here on having seen an example of consent-based decision-making in a traditional hierarchy. I guess I could say I've seen that before too. It comes down to the leader or management operating style and how they bring people into the decision-making process itself. I've worked for a couple of those where it was really by consent, where we met once or twice a week over lunch, and we sorted through basically all of the assignments, what was going on, and all the key decisions during that lunch meeting. And again, it comes down to operating style. At the same time, I've seen others that were working on the same peer level as he was, or my manager was at that time, who was strictly autocratic, didn't take advice from anyone, even if he needed it. So it becomes very situational, I think, versus what we're trying to do is not have it based upon a situational management style, but how to build it into principles that drive the organization.
Yeah, there's one here about what do you show in your annual report as their organizational structure. This is actually an interesting one, because in some countries, such as Germany, there is a legal requirement for certain positions in an organization, and you have to show the structure of the organization and so forth. And there are some schools now in Germany that actually use the same principles of effectuation and a more distributed decision-making process, where even the students select the tutors and so forth. And what they've had to do is, because the law is very often behind progress, as we know in the IT and technology worlds, they actually have a diagram in the traditional sense on the formal documents, but actually operate in a very similar approach to the one that we'll be discussing tomorrow. So there is this issue about the formal structures expected by legislators and others, and the reality of how you operate. And I see this as pretty much no different to the formal organization and the informal organization. Again, you've got the formal rules and regulations to protect the organization, a legal entity, and then how people really get on and do their daily tasks.
To some extent, also, the network structure formalizes the informal organization, because the informal organizations only arise because the formal hierarchy limits what needs to be done. So people are making it up as they go already. They're making the connections through the informal organization, people they know, and problems they're having with people. So to some extent, the informal organization is a current workaround, but it is done haphazard, and because it is a workaround, it may not often be the best approach. Also, because the traditional hierarchy is in place and the control is embedded within that, particularly if you've got silos that are fighting among themselves at the top, that can actually hinder the formation of the informal organization even forming, because it becomes an us versus them competition within the organization, that you don't want to talk to them because they're the enemy, and they're the enemy because the boss says they're the enemy. Okay, so the informal organization obviously is key, but key is how do you take advantage of that without killing it.
There's another comment here about low trust organizations. The first question for me is, what causes the low trust? And unless you can identify what that is, it doesn't matter what you do to an organization, you're not going to build up trust. And so it's going back to that organization and looking at it through a different set of lenses, I guess, and say, right, what is the cause of this lack of trust? Is it about the operating systems? Is it about the management style? Whatever it is. And then start from there. That's your starting point. And you say, right, if it's low trust, what is the first step before we decide to change anything else in this organization? And I would argue that that's the same for any change process.
Interesting comment here about bringing shadow networks that may already exist out into the light of day. That's kind of interesting, because when you think about it, communities of practice was exactly that. Communities of practice formalize the informal connections around a practice or an interest. So that was a mechanism within the knowledge management initiatives to actually formalize the network itself. In other cases, the networks may exist, but all that they need is some recognition that they do exist. And that can be done through purposeful teaming. It can also be done through what we're going to be talking about later today and tomorrow, of how to do purpose alignment. In many cases, the purpose alignment can easily tap into the networks that already exist and take advantage of that through the network weaving function.
There's one here about when commitments, it's gone again. When commitments are broken or do not get fulfilled as promised, trust deteriorates. Absolutely, absolutely. Provided you manage the situation of where that commitment's been broken in the appropriate way, then it's possible actually for trust not to deteriorate, because you will need to get behind what causes that commitment not to be taken. And there are many, many reasons for that. And so rather than look at the issue of the deterioration of trust, let's get to the cause of that deterioration and see how the way we run the organization can actually prevent such things, as opposed to dealing with the symptom of the deterioration of trust.
A question here that I've seen in a couple other presentations also is there a reference or a textbook that has what we're talking about? And I'd say yes and no. Over the last 3 years, Reg and I have looked at a lot of different things. And what's very interesting is that things that are now 20, 30, 40 years old could be written today. For example, I did my doctorate 20 years ago, and I still have stacks of paper that I copied for my research. And I'm slowly going through those. And I've been amazed at how many of those are advocating for new organization styles, new approaches to change. They're articles that could be written today. And that's what got us thinking about the transition. Because if articles written 20, 30 years ago could have been written today, what's happened in that time period? The gap has not closed to the vision that they had. So to some extent, what we've done is look through a lot of what people have been recommending in the past and see where it fits. By saying that, textbooks and many other books on management, organizations, and change have bits and pieces of it. And little of what we're doing is truly original. What we're doing is finding all the little pieces and figuring out how they all fit together. That's how, when I take a look at all these non-traditional organizations, none of them have the total answer, but all of them have part of the answer. And when you put it all together, you start to see a very different vision of how we could organize.
Yeah, someone's put a recommendation there of a couple of favorite books, and one of them, Reinventing Organizations. When Frederick Laloux first published that book, I actually flew out to the UK from Austria, where I'm based, and had a meeting with him and discussed it in quite some detail. And it reinforced for me that much of what he found was segments that Ross has just said, that there are bits of everything. And then if we start pulling them together, then maybe we've got a chance of creating something that gets the benefits of all those different approaches. And it was a very fascinating meeting and discussion with him, and really got our minds going in terms of bringing the essence of what works in different areas. How can we bring them together without actually causing them to collide or break down? And that's been the biggest challenge, I think.
Okay, speaking to Gary Wong specifically, I'm not familiar with the Crystal's team of teams. Maybe you could send me that, or I could take a look at it later. The vision that we see coming out will be laid out on Thursday. More information needs to be really put together obviously we've got too much information here even for 4 presentations as to what does this mean for change management, and in particular, what does this mean for the role of change management specialists. So for example, if change becomes a business model itself and organizations are designed for change, and all managers or leaders across the organization are leading change, the role for change specialists becomes more back to the original focus, I think, of organization development. How to come in and help some of that happen. They don't come in and necessarily manage the process, but it is a distinct role, as well as coming in and helping in the training and seeing the big picture. Okay. Part of this also is not only looking at all the pieces and how they come together, but I think some of the failures in the past is to take a look at the transition between the current control-oriented hierarchy and a more visionary, passionate, entrepreneurial organization. A lot of times they present the end state, or they present the end state as goals without thinking about the gap itself and how people have to move that. It's not necessarily a jump at once, but if you take a look at the principles, what principles can be employed now and over time, and how those principles will then ripple effect in the structure and the operations over time.
There's one there, Ross, which you might want to comment on, the humanocracy.
Yes. Humanocracy, a lot of this has come out, and many of the examples that I gave today are actually right within the book Humanocracy. So there's a direct tie there. When I got Humanocracy, I was one of probably the first adopters of it and started reading up about it. Actually, when Hamill did a podcast is when I first became familiar with it and got involved with doing as much reading about it before, and went back to their Harvard Business Review article that predated Humanocracy by a year or two and read that. I really like it. I like the end state, but I was a little disappointed, truthfully, with the book itself, in that the book laid out a great framework of examples that got it, and then it jumped over a small middle section. I'll come back to in a minute. And then the end was basically new principles around humanocracy. So what the authors did was look at these examples and generalize it into a series of principles. But I don't think the principles were quite as clear as what Reg and I are coming up with as for how to put them into practice and what they really mean. And the middle part I found really disappointing in a way that they laid the groundwork for humanocracy, or really human-oriented or human-focused organizations, the organizations that we want to inhabit. They built that up as a groundswell similar to what would have happened in the past with the suffrage movement for a woman's right to vote, similar to the equal rights for racial minorities, similar to the union movement. In all three cases, those were dramatic social movements that they're putting humanocracy on the same scale as an equivalent dramatic social movement. And I agree that it is that in context, but I don't see the grassroots passion to pull it together. That is what I see as the missing piece that I think we're trying to fill, is what is the grassroots so we can actually take action on and get away from the big picture vision and start to actually do things. To that extent, there is a Slack group on humanocracy that were started by the authors and actually built out of a book of add-on. If you bought the book, if you don't know, there's actually a series of courses and webinars, lectures that supplement the book that you can actually subscribe to using information from the receipt on your purchase of the book. That effort led into a large webinar, which led into the Slack group. But again, it hasn't really been shepherded forward, and it's somewhat disjointed. And again, I think it's got promise in the vision, but middle pieces need to be put in place.
Yeah. There's a comment by Gavin Laurie about another book that's recommended, which is the Consulting for Real People. I know this very, very well because I was with them when they wrote it. Sadly, Peter Coleman is now dead. Bill Evans is just recovering from a heart attack. Peter Reynolds has vanished from the scene. The book is about how we behave, how we communicate with each other, and so forth. And if you're interested in that, then Bill Evans actually runs courses still in the UK, which I recommend to anybody who wants to really get to know themselves. And also he's started some online versions of the course. So the book, I think, is still out of print, but he's still very much in business, and it's Consulting for Real People. If you go onto his site, you'll see it. I don't see any new ones.
I don't see anything either. And we're coming up near the end of our time period to give a little bit of a break between this one and the next. Good comments, though.
Yep.
And again, the recording will be posted in the video library. Navigate there to the top of the Change Management Network and then down through the topics. Also, we will be continuing to post additional content as we get it developed. Much of the content that's in these 4 presentations will be actually put into articles that we'll be posting also. So look forward to that going forward.
Yeah, as Jeffrey Sage talks about this, you can build trust as the communications between the committing parties are robust. We really focus on that in what we'll be talking about tomorrow at 6 o'clock tomorrow evening, Austrian time, because it is about communication. Trust is very much about communication, and often in organizations, the current management don't even meet the staff, let alone have a communication with them. So it's little wonder that there's not a lot of trust in most organizations today. So we look at the approach to organizations by looking at it differently. We want to develop the communication, but the communication in the way that supports what people are doing and how they're working, as opposed to trying to control them. And this is a very important distinction we find.
Gary mentioned the Wonder Room. Many people aren't familiar with Wonder Room as a new technology. It's really a dynamic video chat, interesting experience. Gary and I, Reg and I will be meeting after the presentation tomorrow in the Wonder Room to chat or go into breakup groups to go into further detail. But you can go into the Wonder Room right now. Within the agenda, there's a Wonder Room link that is running the full 72 hours of the conference. All you need to do is go there, sign in, and it creates a little icon for you. And you could use your mouse to move around the wall. All you need to do is find somebody else's icon, get close to them, and immediately you're put into a video chat. Others can then join your video chat to actually have a group chat. There are some suggested areas on the wall where you can group if you want to talk about a particular topic, or you can actually go anywhere. If you find the discussion boring, leave that group and find another group. So the Wonder Room is operational right now.
I saw that there was a question about building learning organizations. Do you have any quick thoughts on that before we log off?
Yeah, a lot of my background actually comes out of Singi's work. I was involved early on with change when Peter Singi's 5th Discipline in the Field Book and the Dance of Change came out. While I was doing my doctorate, I was a member of the Society of Organizational Learning and attended a couple of their conferences where I met Singi. Also actually met Otto Schumer. There was an earlier presentation, or there's one coming up on Theory U. I met Otto when he had the theory in draft form, and he was basically bouncing off the group for comments. So I thought that was kind of interesting how it's developed since then. So to a large extent, if you take a look at my background on change, it is influenced heavily by the learning organization. It is also influenced heavily by complexity science of how organizations can have emergence or self-organization and how things can be influenced. And if you haven't had a chance, Gary Wong's done some excellent presentations in the past for the network, and is also doing 2 this week where he gets into great detail on the Kuhneven model, which is part of complexity science. It's a way of thinking about organizations differently. And to some extent, the work that Reg and I are doing draws upon that also, at least indirectly in how it influences our thinking. Was there a more specific question on organizational learning or learning organization that you had beyond that?
I can just comment on the learning organization. Very few organizations that I've ever come across or even read about are very good at this. One of my students is currently doing his thesis on this very subject, using technology to help improve knowledge transfer and organizational learning. And people talk about sort of double loop and triple loop learning. Just getting the information back into the organization and the organization picking it up and using it for future work is a hell of a challenge. And so one of the things that I think is important for the approach that Ross and I are suggesting is this is inherent within this way this organization works. It's actually almost a prerequisite for success in this type of organization, that you are collaborating at this level and transferring this learning and information throughout the organization. It doesn't rely on someone redesigning processes and people, experts going into a room and we get grey smoke suddenly when they've come up with this eureka new process, which everyone ignores because it's not reality. And so the organization learning, we believe, needs to reinforce itself continually. And the processes are developed as a result of the experience of what succeeds and what doesn't.
Okay, we're at the end of our time period. Any last minute questions? I think
we got Femi who's raised his hand. Where are you, Femi? There he is up here. Okay. How can we help you? Can you hear us, Femi? Yep, no. In fact, okay. He's vanished now. Perhaps he was saying cheerio.
Okay. He was waving goodbye. Okay. Yeah. Great conversation, everyone. Great questions. Reg, I really appreciate these questions because it helps us to confirm or challenge our thinking that we've been doing for the last 3 years. And to some extent, we've been using this network for the last year. Bouncing some of the ideas off, and we appreciate that. This again is the second of 4. Later today, I will be going more detail into the principles that we've just talked about and how to take them into design. And then tomorrow, Reg will lead a discussion as to how we're pulling it all together and how some of the pieces fit together at that point. So again, any other questions come up, I will track not only as replies to this, but I will track anywhere within the Change Management Network. Just be sure to go ahead and flag me with the @Rossworth so I'm able to be sure to see it. There's been so much activity going on this week that I haven't been able to really read everything that I have in the past. Reg, any other comments you have before we conclude?
There's just a question here, how to register for tomorrow. Just the same as today, go on to the appropriate link on the network platform. You'll see it there for either the early morning one with Ross. I wish you well on that, Ross. You'll be in my dreams. And or tomorrow evening in European time at 6 p.m. You'll see them on the links there, and just click on to join us. And we look forward to seeing you.
Okay. Very good, everyone. Great conversation. Appreciate the questions and look forward to connecting again later today and tomorrow. Have a good day, everyone.
Cheers then.
Bye-bye.